Hello, and welcome to another edition of Become Your Own Healer. I'm Dr. Gerald Epstein. Thank you for joining me today. And I wanted to carry on a theme that I had begun in our previous meetings together, and two issues that I thought would be helpful to enlarge upon are false emergencies and the concept of disease. And I call it a concept because it is an idea. And the question really is it an actual reality or a truth? And I don't use the terms interchangeably because reality and truth are not the same. And I hope to amplify that a little later. But in starting off about the false emergencies and disease, they lead one into the other. As I had started to explain, when we are embroiled in what we consider a threat to our survival, an acute and immediate threat, which is called an emergency, which gives us a sense of urgency and a necessity to take some action, we have to define for ourselves whether it's true or false, because there are different consequences that occur. Whenever we perceive an emergency, there's always a mechanism that's thrown into play in our physiological, biological self, which is called the fight-flight response. It was enunciated over 50 years ago by a physiologist named Hans Selye, and it is a natural function of our biological being to prepare for these emergency states, to generate resources to help deal on a physical basis with the occurrence. If the emergency is false, that is where there is no actual threat to our survival at this moment, where there is no real danger, true danger rather, of our losing our existence, there is a mobilizing of resources, as it is in the fight-flight response generally, except that there's no legitimate outlet or release available for the resources that we call into play. In the true emergency, there's always a possibility of a release, either through fight or through flight, fundamentally. But in the false emergency, what happens is that the fight-flight is frozen, and there is no real outlet available. So you could be sitting in the middle of your living room and suddenly feel a great sense of urgency, accompanied by anxiety, which is an emotional component that fuels the emergency state, gives it great intensity, and these are emotional states that have to do with the future. And we had talked about the emergency state being such that you are projecting, in the false sense of it, into a time, place, and circumstance that doesn't exist, called the future. And the future is treated as a thing, as an existence now, and taking that possibility or potential and making it seem to be a concrete availability at this present moment, an image that exists right now. But it doesn't exist. It's you're taking that abstraction and making it into a current reality. Consequently, we call that process of doing that a mirage. And you notice that a mirage is an image that's projected, that we're all familiar with, for example, of the classic experience of the man in the desert who sees an oasis, and he is so elated to see it, he crawls toward it because he's dying of thirst, and when he gets to the oasis, he discovers that it's merely sand, and of course he feels defeated and deflated, which is what happens when we discover that our projections are mirages. Nevertheless, we're sitting in our living room, embroiled in an emergency state, We're behaving as though there is a definitive threat. The body is called upon to mobilize resources because it gets a mental trigger impulse that there is something to be concerned about, and it mobilizes the resources that are mobilized in the fight-flight response. These include insulin from the pancreas, glycogen from the liver, steroids from the adrenal cortex, adrenaline and noradrenaline from the adrenal medulla, and I might add parenthetically that noradrenaline is the most dangerous chemical that we do produce in the body. Literally scars the heart, and it's one of its major destructive elements. In addition, there is the thyroid hormones are thrown into play. The pituitary hormones are activated. There is a neuromuscular tension, so that the sympathetic nervous system is heightened in its activity, and the muscles begin to contract, creating a substance called lactic acid, which is a metabolic waste product of muscle contraction. All this is thrown into the system, and we become essentially a virtual pharmacy. And of course, there's no availability for the release of it, of these substances. So we have a cellular imbalance occurring and a neuromuscular tension, which leads to the next phase, which is the breakdown of these metabolic processes, and they become a source of the metabolites, which are toxic products that are thrown into the system, and the breakdown products have to be swept out. They have to be cleansed, and therefore there's an adaptational state that's created in us to do that. There's a natural tendency in us to seek balance. It's a tropism that we have as human beings, much like the tropism that a plant has, that is an inclination toward, an instinctual or inherent inclination toward something. For the plant, it's toward light. For us, it's toward balance. And we live under a universal law of balance, and our job is to seek balance. And consequently, the adaptational phase that we go through is done to get rid of all of these metabolites and these toxins. Consequently, we experience the cleansing of our system by such experiences as nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, sweating, pain, achiness, stiffness, constipation. It could be a whole host of different symptoms that we, or different reactions that we experience, which in the medical parlance are called symptoms. So what happens then is that if we create these chronic situations of emergencies, and we're constantly projecting to a time, place, and circumstance that doesn't exist, and constantly creating emergencies thereby, we are constantly forcing ourselves into an adaptational state which becomes an unusual one. That is, our system is called on overtime to work. That is, there is an excess of usage of our systemic organs to take care of these metabolic products that are constantly being produced. Now, when the system becomes old from overusage and wearing out, it becomes decayed. And that decay is called, in medical parlance, disease. So you know we have a Merck manual that exists, which has the name of perhaps 10,000 different disease names, and they all could go under one name, decay, or a synonymous term for decay is imbalance. There really is no such thing as disease. It really is an unusual cellular adaptational state which can be restored or reversed. And that's, of course, what we have in mind when we talk about becoming our own healer, to reverse these metabolic processes. And by doing that, we can therefore stay within a balanced frame of reference in our lives. And with a balanced frame of reference, we don't age, and we don't become sick, and we remain well, and we become we stay in an integrated, balanced frame of life. We have at hand then a possibility given to us to make a change based on this understanding, because we have control, whether we have been taught this or not. It should be understood that we have control over these biological functions through the use of the mind. Since the mind has acted to mislead us, the mind can also act to lead us. It can be a great healer, it can be a great slayer. And we're now talking about how to use the mind to heal. In terms of the emergency states, the simple process that can be utilized is to make a discernment for yourself to find out whether the emergency state is true or false. And it's rather simple to do, because a true emergency, again, is defined as a direct threat to your existence at the present time, which I described previously as someone holding a gun to your head about to blow your brains out, or you're on that plane that's going into the World Trade Center. And I use these rather graphic examples as a way of emphasizing how to detect the true emergency. Probably, if you look over your life and reflect upon your life, you'll find that there's hardly been a true emergency in your life. Although the emergencies that you've created appear to be that way, they've been essentially, and we could say conservatively, 99.5% false. And so once you define for yourself the experience that you're facing as either true or false, and you define it as false, what happens is that you will immediately, by doing that, stop the cellular imbalance, you'll stop the neuromuscular tension. When you stop those two features, then you stop the cellular adaptational state, there's no need for it, and consequently you stop the decay. What that leads to, I will reserve for a future discussion, but one of the things to note for yourself is that I would venture to say, and I have had this in my own experience and the people I've worked with, that when you stop the emergency state and you are immediately restoring yourself to balance, some very unusual things begin to happen for you in your life. And you'll begin to see many results coming to you that will reflect a sense of benefit and progress in your life experience. It's a simple process to do. Just the awareness of the emergency state, whether it's true or false, and noting that to yourself has enormous benefit and enormous consequences of a positive nature. I might add, by the way, that when you decide on the emergency state, and if it's a false emergency, it's useful to say to yourself that it's a false emergency and that it has no value. So you want to add that on, and I think that amplifies the situation on your behalf and creates an open space. It creates a distance, so to speak, an opening, if you will, that puts you at separates you from the disturbing experience. In that open space, you give the universe a chance to operate, and the universe will give to you what you need. The universe is always acting on your behalf. It always wants to give you what it has to offer for you, because it's a life force that's always available to us. And what I'm showing you by this way is how to make yourself available to this life force and how to use this life force, bring it into your life for your own purposes. So I think that this is a very simple way to approach your life situation, and we have others to follow that are as simple as this process, because the life of spirit is a simple life, and it trades in simplicity, and it wants to offer ways that are simple, not complicated, and not to create complications in your life. Now, one of the things that we might look at in terms of understanding the origin of the emergency state. And I think it's useful to know this because it has many ramifications for us. And I would use as a model, a paradigm for this understanding, a statement that was given to us in the book of Deuteronomy. I use this reference because the medicine that I'm sharing with you, which is a spiritual medicine of the West, has its roots in our ancient tradition of Western civilization. And what I am doing is unfolding it in a contemporary way for use in our life as we live it here in the 21st century. But we unfold this spiritual tradition in a way that's useful, practical, practicable, and available for everyone to partake in. So the phrase that comes to us from the book of Deuteronomy is one in which God is speaking to the people and says, "At every moment I set before you life and death, good and evil. Choose life, essentially so that you and your descendants may live." This is somewhat of a paraphrase of the statement, but it's really accurate. And the question that's set before us then, in terms of our everyday life experience, is choosing life or choosing death. And we want to focus on what it is to choose life, and what does that mean, and what does it mean to choose death. The emergency states that I've been talking about, and the mirage or fabrication of disease states, which really don't exist. They are made-up names to create a sense of fear and panic in us, and to give one group an authority over us in terms of supposed expertise and knowledge, is such that we want to be able to extricate ourselves from taking a direction in a way that hastens our mortality. Choosing life, and God said, if you choose life, you will live. And the meaning of that is that you will live. And it's a term that means that life is extended, that the promise is that there is continuous life to be explored and to be experienced if you choose life. So life has to do with the relationship from the Western tradition between ourselves and an invisible being who came forth over 4,000 years ago and had an encounter with Abraham, Father Abraham, who had a revelatory experience of meeting this great being, albeit an invisible one, who said essentially to Abraham, "I love you, and in exchange for my love, I want you to love me, and in doing that, you will have all that you need to sustain you on this earth." I mentioned before that when you give up the emergency state and you relinquish your hold on it and take a distance from it and create the space, the universe gives you what you need. And that's an everyday experience that proves this assertion that was made in the sacred contract between God and Abraham, where God said that in this exchange relationship between the two of us, you will be provided with all that you need, and that you'll never have to be concerned with your survival on this earth, because I will give it to you. And the exchange relationship occurred within a context of a situation that existed at that time where there were over 700 tribes in that region of the world in the ancient Near East, all of whom practiced a polytheistic form of exchange relationship tradition in which there were many gods which were used as in a utilitarian way. So the exchange relationship was that the god demanded some sort of sacrifice, often human, in return for providing some means of sustenance for life, and that could be rain, it could be crops, it could be any sort of physical reward that would be given in exchange for some sort of sacrifice to the gods based on a utilitarian function. So what Abraham did was to create an exchange relationship based in a steadfast, determined way with one particular god who was not visible. And all of these polytheistic gods were visible and were sought after and added onto. There were more and more that were added onto as more and more needs would crop up within the community. In this one, what was asked was devotion, and that the sacrifice to be made was that of devoting oneself to this exchange being in a prayerful and loving manner. So the exchange relationship is what's meant by choosing life, that when you have a decision to be made that faces you almost at every moment, you choose for the relationship. That is, that you choose in terms of accepting that what you do will be rewarded, will be given, something will be given back to you. So you have at every moment the choice of choosing for the relationship or choosing for the path of death. And death is a time-bound term. Death has to do with your time that you have given to you supposedly on this earth. It has to do with our relationship to the future and to the past, to those experiences that are connected with time, and that time therefore becomes a determinant of your life. So we'll explore this subject some more in our future talks together. And I wanted to add something about a reference I made earlier about the mind being the greatest healer or the greatest slayer. My experience has been that coming from the region of the mind as I've been trained, particularly as a psychiatrist, as a psychoanalyst, and as a devotee of the use of imagination in a therapeutic and educative way, I have found that there are three functions of the mind that are of great importance in terms of our ability to choose life. And I call these three tendencies which interfere with our ability to live in a harmonious, balanced, integrated way by the terms doubt, expectation, and denial. And these three supply us an acronym which is called DED, D-E-D. So doubt is the function of the mind which deals with our experience of the moment and the direct impetus to take action that we're faced with at each moment, to choose. That choosing is always put before us, and that we have to choose for an action. And what happens, generally speaking, is that instead of choosing for the action, we tend to hesitate. We tend to step back from the action, and we find ourselves falling into a state of indecision. And this indecision paralyzes us from taking appropriate action, and it's parallel to the false emergency state, which also serves to paralyze us from taking the immediate release response that we need. So we need to take action, and this action is inhibited by what we call a second voice, a voice that comes and speaks to us in the future and speaks to us about time and says, if you do this, then this may happen. You better not do this because you won't be such and such. if you do this, you would have this to face, and so on. So stories are made up. Stories are made up in our mind that we call doubt. It's a second voice, we call it, that whispers to us and stops us from taking the necessary action that we are impelled to do. This action we will talk about later on in terms of our understanding of intuition. But for now, we know that doubt acts as an inhibitory agent to prevent us from taking our necessary step in the moment. Expectation is the second feature of the mind, which is to futurize, that is to leap into the future or to project into the future again into the realm of time, so that we make an expectation, and most of the time you'll notice that when you expect, it isn't fulfilled. So then we feel disappointed, then we feel hurt, and then we blame either someone else or ourselves for the lack of fulfillment of the expectation. And this comes concomitant with some distressing emotional state: anxiety, guilt, fear, panic, or any one of its associated states: worry, hostility, envy, whatever distressing emotional state. And within 1 to 72 hours of that, we will see a physical symptom and or an addictive craving. So expectation is again a futurizing activity, and like doubt, projects us into time. And once we get projected into time, we choose for time rather than choosing for the relationship. And then we are then talking about denial, which is again not to face qualities of us that we see expressed towards us by these experiences and the people we meet in this life, especially when you bump up against those who are disturbing you. And when you come into a disturbing experience in this life, it's very useful to see that the experience is really a reflection back to you of you, and that you're seeing a quality of you being advanced toward you. So if you keep bumping up against somebody who is angry towards you, it really essentially means at first that it's a quality of you that is being reflected back from the mirror of your external life. So you're looking into your external life and seeing yourself reflected back to you, and that usually represents some element of the past which you have refused to embrace for yourself, and have instead alienated yourself from it, denied its genuineness and authenticity for yourself, have said that it's not part of you, and have therefore not embraced it and made an authentic quality of self. And we will talk in our next meeting about what to do about these three elements of doubt, expectation, and denial, and how we can offset their detrimental impact in our lives. So let's do an image now based on what we've talked about today. And I'd like to do an image for you on decision making. And so close your eyes, sit up straight, arms in the arms of the chair, feet flat on the floor. If you don't have arms, put your hands on your thighs, palms down. And begin to breathe evenly and regularly. Breathe out through your mouth, in through your nose. Breathe out long, slow exhalations through your mouth, normal inhalations through the nose. And the key to making this work for you in the image capacity is the long, slow exhalation. So I'm going to ask you to breathe out now a certain number of times as you find yourself breathing evenly and regularly in this way. I'm going to ask you to breathe out 3 long exhalations. That is, you breathe out before breathing in on each count. So breathe out now 3 times. Long, slow exhalations. Remember to breathe out before breathing in on each count, and make your exhalations long and slow through the mouth. Normal inhalation through the nose. And see yourself holding a double-edged sword. And feel the sharpness of each edge of this sword. And you're holding it with 2 hands at the hilt, holding it against your chest. And you raise the sword now to bring it down toward an obstacle that's in front of you. And this obstacle can be of any concrete nature. It could be a rock or any other kind of object that you see in front of you that you can imagine as an obstacle. Now, lift the sword back toward you, high over your head, and firmly come down in a very intensive way to break this obstacle, to cut through it with this sword, knowing that if you don't and you refuse, that the sword will rebound and the edge that's facing you will cut you in half. See, sense, and feel what happens when you're able to break through the obstacle, knowing that you have created the possibility for yourself for decision making. And after, breathe out and open your eyes.